The year 2017 has seen a fair share of a looming crisis in the capitalist society, from political upheavals, wealth concentration, and trade protectionism to fracturing in public opinions. Now, Karl Marx, the 19th century German philosopher, believed that socialism would create a better future beyond capitalism. That still remains a big public debate 150 years after the publication of Das Kapital, a landmark book by this guy. How do we understand his theories in today's practice? Why do we see the rise of neoliberalism against the retreat of new socialism? What does socialism mean for China's future in the new era? To answer these questions and more, we are happy to be joined here by Charles Liu, founder of How Capital, and Ravish Bhatia, Yanqing Academy Scholar of Peking University, Claire Pearson, DRA Piper Law Firm International Director, and Anna Tang, writer and columnist. That's our topic. This is Dialogue's year-end special. This year, 2017, marks the 150th anniversary of the original publication of Karl Marx, Das Kapital. Now, to my surprise, some of the German media players believe that his landmark book on capital still matters for much of the developed countries and many developing countries. So I'd like to have your thoughts on why we see growing popularity of a notebook that was published 150 years ago, Anna.
Well, Das Kapital was a landmark. We have to go back 150 years. You're talking about the Industrial Revolution. Today, we face a new revolution. It's called technology. It threatens to take away jobs and transform society. Very rarely have you had this kind of economic change without political, social, and even cultural consequences. So I think it's a very good starting point for trying to address the world as it is going to become, not as it was.
Claire?
Think about it when that book was written. What was it like for Marx living in the UK at the time? Who were his contemporaries? People like Dickens. Who was he writing about? The Fate of Capitalism was Fagin, somebody exploiting children in the workhouse.
But he also wrote the book Great Expectations and Tale of Two Cities between London and Peking, right?
Maybe he was imagining a future in China, but maybe he wasn't imagining a future where somebody like Fagin could own 50 factories in 50 countries. The issue of socialism, the concept of Das Kapital, is highly pertinent today, because whereas when Marx was writing that book, he only imagined it in a contained environment, it's now a global issue how capital is managed, and that's why I think it's highly pertinent today.
Ravish, some of the politicians may have misunderstood the original message that Karl Marx delivered 150 years ago about socialism, since these people in the East, in Asia, for example, believe that socialism is more about egalitarianism, whether it comes to the land reform or income redistribution among the disadvantaged and underprivileged social classes here. Are you a fan of this idea or concerned?
I'm definitely a fan, partly at least. Capitalism today has strangely become a word that elicits emotions almost as strong as the word terrorism does. When Karl Marx was talking about the concept of wealth and whether wealth is something that needs to be distributed or to be competed for, in Das Kapital, he used capitalism as a means of production and a practice of production in what society. I mean, we've seen hard times. They keep coming and going. They're the reason why we come up with these socioeconomic theories. In today's world, I think, completely agreeing with your point, with technology, we're seeing a revival of the internet and especially the information economic networks, where people work not just for, or the factors of production or social production has become more common. Now people are sharing their codes on the internet for free. They're working as a group. Wikipedia is now a massive information network organization that's run by volunteers. And in many ways, especially with the economy that we are now jumping into, from the industrial economy to the information economy, these concepts of social production are having a revival back in a new era. And that's where I feel Karl Marx, at least in today's generation, is more relevant.
Late senior leader Deng Xiaoping said that with the end of the Cold War, particularly the demise of the former Soviet Union, which was described by Ronald Reagan as an evil empire, the communist movement has dropped to a historical low, except for the rise of China. And the ruling party, the biggest of its kind, is still called the Chinese Communist Party, and the recent successful conclusion of the 19th National Congress aims to put the party control on everything. On everything. At the same time, Charles, Western media accuse China of practicing state capitalism instead of communism in the classical sense, at least in the words of Karl Marx. I'd like to invite a capitalist, founder of Kapital, to make serious comments on the impact of communism on the present-day China.
I think I'd like to go back to what Warren Buffett, the big capitalist, said a few weeks ago after his visit to China. He said, what happened in China was inconceivable. It never happened in human history. 600 million people lived out of poverty. To grow the way it has grown and brought prosperity to all its populace. The reason he believed that it happened is because of the system. He described it as it's not socialism, it's not communism, it's not capitalism, but it's the Chinese system of a government wanting to do something and very enthusiastic, energetic, hardworking, and smart people contributing to the whole process. So I think the whole idea of trying to make a distinction between communism, socialism, capitalism is outdated today. I think we have to look at when Karl Marx wrote Das Kapital, he was living in the first industrial revolution phase. We were looking at industrialization more than anything else. And he put all kinds of things about surplus value, about this and that. Now we have, as you said, a more complicated situation of technology replacing capital, or parts of capital, but also capital owning technology. Yeah. The 10 top market cap companies in the world today, 9 are technology companies.
And let's go back to what happened at the National Congress, the 19th National Congress of the CPC. President Xi Jinping said proudly, not a single Chinese national should be left behind in the unprecedented poverty alleviation campaign. Having said this, some of the overseas observers are very critical of China's income disparity, saying the rich feel the tip of the iceberg, contribute far less tax to the healthy social development and economic expansion. Having said this, do you think, let's look at the issue from the European and American perspective, do you think we should learn more from Scandinavian countries, which really practice socialism, not in terms of egalitarianism, but with the adoption of welfare policies, and that's also adopted in most, if not all, of the old parts of Europe, United Kingdom of Britain, Germany, France, so on and so forth. So do we have a role model to learn so that socialism itself, conceptually and in practice, would be improved to benefit everyone?
Well, first off, as regards to the U.S. and Europe, people who live in glass houses shouldn't throw bricks. So, getting that out of the way, the fact is China does not have a model to follow. And that's quite clear. Everything that China stands for today is a kind of contrary to this notion that you could mix a market economy with a state-controlled economy. All right, that there's somehow you can do this. I think the challenge going forward is when you start talking about Marx is how China will reconcile Marxism with its traditional values like Confucianism and create a society. The difficulty with Deng Xiaoping, as we've all identified, is that he moved towards pragmatism. All right, he said, look, we're going to go with what works. He changed the language away from the proletarian, workers' paradise to black cat, white cat, crossing the river by feeling the stones. And there was an echo of this when Xi talked about this, because he said development is an endless journey, and there's no goal. You cannot arrive. All you can do is continue the process itself. And I think that goes back to what Warren Buffett said. It's the system, the planning, the way that China has done that is responsible for their success. So when you start talking about the models, China is creating their own model that's appropriate for them. Looking at Scandinavia, where you have countries of 4, 5, 6 million people, it's not scalable. All right? They have other things and special conditions. China has to match its development to what it has. China is number 100, around 100 in the world in terms of resources per person. It gets a lot of its income from this idea of bringing resources in and then shipping value-added goods out. It has the Belt and Road Initiative. These are all initiatives which are aimed at making China not only great, but in a context that's sustainable. And I think this is what she and a lot of the planners here have been looking for, a sustainable model that is uniquely Chinese, but not being opposed ideologically on others.
Karl Marx is also the author or productive author on scientific socialism, encouraging working class to overthrow the ruling class in what is called the revolutionary violence. Look at what happened through the October Revolution in Moscow. Now, having said this, the ownership of private assets has become a common practice for the working class, or what we used to call proletarians. These guys, working class, blue-collar workers, could become stakeholders or shareholders in the stock market. Therefore, they become the owners of private assets. They no longer serve as the power base of the, or proletarians no longer serve as the power base for the ruling class or the revolutionary class. So, Claire, taking the United Kingdom as an example, particularly with the privatization of the state-owned assets during the years of Lady Thatcher, what can we learn from the UK in changing and reforming the ownership itself? Because that says a lot about the nature of socialism.
So I'm born in 1971, and at that point Britain was very, very socialist. When I went to school, I had an excellent education for free. When I was sick, I had an excellent health service for free. When I had a period at university where I couldn't afford my rent, I had housing benefit for free. So people like me from a not well-off background were able to progress evenly through school, through university, into a professional career. Come Thatcherism, things change. Because when Mrs. Thatcher took over, it was similar to Thatcherism, Reaganomics, it's similar. Reduce taxes for the rich because we're going to rely on the trickle-down theory, because the rich will empower the poor with a little bit of money they drop. Really? Are they not going to set up an offshore account rather than give to hardcore charity? That's the reality. So social mobility was actually stemmed by Thatcherism. That was a point at which education became less impartially free. Healthcare became less readily accessible, completely free. So I think Margaret Thatcher, she really succeeded into dividing Britain in a way that I wouldn't have considered possible when I was a child. What do we have today? When I was a child, the Gini coefficient, the measure of wealth inequality, 0 to 5, was 2.5. Today, 3.5. So I grew up at a time when you could move from 0 to hero. Today, very difficult because the students get saddled with debt. They have high rent. It's hard to buy a flat. If you want your country to be Great Britain, United Kingdom, you need to unite the people economically, politically, and via equality of opportunity.
Ravish, do you think Prime Minister Modi somehow represents the diamond standard bearer in improving the working class being or livelihoods? What does he represent in terms of this socialism that the National Congress Party practiced very well, right?
Yeah. I think what the present administration has specifically made it clear is that the models of economic growth that we so far, or at least what classical economics or traditional economics have taught us, are not universally applicable to all societies. Where our needs are very different, our societies are structured very differently, our problems are very different. Just like Britain and China, we have a high Gini coefficient. There are systemic inequalities at play, but I think the strongest period of growth that India saw was post-91, when it opened itself to freer markets. The challenges that came with that were the same as that came with Reaganomics and with Ms. Thatcher and the whole emergence of neoliberal economic order, which I think is neither liberal nor orderly. But nevertheless, those are systemic challenges that question the Chicago school of thought and the school of thought that has been put by its founders that are mostly in the West. What India, much like many of its developing partners are doing across the world, is to trying to find a model of economic growth that is specific to them, is localized in nature, and takes the best and the brightest characteristics from both socialism as well as capitalism.
In India, you have free media, opposition parties in the Congress to oversee the behavior of the ruling party. However, Charles, Prime Minister Modi is said to be a humble student of Deng Xiaoping theories for being very practical in drastically improving the livelihoods of the ordinary folks. Now, the thing is that, very controversially, China comes under fire for encouraging a handful of people to get rich first in our experiment with the capitalism and with the overseas investment in the first 3 decades of China's opening up. However, the 19th National Congress, a successful landmark event, sees Xi Jinping thought being written into the party constitution to guarantee not a single Chinese should be left behind in the poverty alleviation. Does that mean we are one step closer to egalitarianism, at least to put it more politically correct, it's an effort at income redistribution to guarantee that we can have the middle class growing stronger instead of having the two ends across the broad spectrum?
No, I think all of those approaches or discussions from the Western media is improper. Poverty alleviation is something that the whole world needs to do, and China's taking a lead in this. And basically, I think for Xi Jinping's 19th Party Congress message is, we have at least been able to feed our people now. We've been able to bring many of them out of poverty, and we've been able to create some wealth for a newly rising middle class. So no one should be left behind. But that has nothing
So what
to
about
do
millions of kids left behind when their parents become migrant workers? What about the elderly? What about the lonely hearts
they
of the
all
women,
have
their
to
wives?
be taken care of, and they have to be addressed. Now you take, for example, the latest 10% of the state-owned enterprises are to put the shares, their equity shares, into the Social Security fund. These are things which are gradually addressing these issues. And what you're talking about in terms of left behinds, the elderly health care, what the 19th Party Congress, I see, seeks to do is precisely to address these issues. So what we're talking about, again, is not socialism or communism and so on. China cannot be ruled like Singapore. Singapore has been ruled as semi-socialist for all these years. Singapore is the size of Chaoyang district in Beijing. You can't compare it. And also the other part is that it's very, very difficult to make sure that at all levels of society there is sufficient sophistication and education and cultural basis to be able to develop properly. And these are problems that China has. I think India has as well. Now, coming back to the issue of India, India can learn from Deng Xiaoping if the central government actually has real control. If the central government has the means and the willingness and the ability to build infrastructure.
Oh, by the way,
to combine the country
during
into
his
one.
1992 fact-finding tour of southern China, Deng Xiaoping said humbly, I didn't read many books about classical Marxism or socialism, but just basic common sense helped me a lot in pushing the economic expansion and experiments with perhaps what we call capitalism later on. Now, Anna, Karl Marx, a 19th century German philosopher, do you think he's going to be happy with what Deng Xiaoping did for the first three decades of our economic reform?
Well,
Deng Xiaoping said, I'm not a dogmatic student of Karl Marx. Do you think that indicates rebellion against what Karl Marx stood for in the 19th century?
look, Karl Marx was never running a country. And let's put this into perspective. He was a philosopher who was reacting to an inhuman system that had basically enslaved people. So his comments were on capitalism. Remember, capitalism is not an ideology in the real sense of the word. It just has this faith-based thing that if you somehow take the factors of production, the 4 factors of production, and allow the free market to have free reign, you'll have all sorts of wonderful things happen in terms of efficiency and progress. And he did not see that happening. All he saw was this Gini coefficient going through the roof, people suffering, and he said there has to be a better way if we are going to be a society. So, yes, I think he would approve very much of what Deng did simply because he improved the lot of the common person. This is what Karl Marx was trying to get at. He just did not see the wealthy controlling classes giving up voluntarily their control over these factors of production, which included human beings. So, yes, absolutely.
So next year, when we see the 200th anniversary of the birth of Karl Marx in his hometown in Germany, I would have a strong mixed feeling about what has happened in China since the publication of Das Kapital. Now it's time to take questions from the audience here. Would you raise your hands and target anyone from the 4 panelists?
I have a question. Would you consider China to be a socialist country?
No,
Yes or no?
I would
look me in the eye and say yes or no.
No, I said it at the very beginning. I don't think it's a question
no,
of
in the
socialism.
sense of Scandinavian countries, or no in the original sense of Karl Marx. What do you mean by no?
No, because this is China's socialism with Chinese characteristics.
Oh.
Okay? It is something that is not in the traditional sense of socialism or communism or capitalism. If China addressing its own particular set of situations and particular set of problems. You cannot use a theory of ism to address the specific issues that the Chinese leadership has to address. To do so would be ridiculous.
I'm going to disagree with that. I would say that China fulfills the goals of a socialist society, and that is bringing more fairness to all those involved. How it does that, I don't think is that important. The issue is, are they making progress on it? This is where I agree with Deng Xiaoping's progress towards this. He didn't care about how you got there. Remember? Cross the river by feeling of stones. Black cat, white cat. Who cares? It catches mice. This was the whole point. You went from this flowery dialogue that Mao had about this workers' paradise, but it wasn't working. So, yes, pragmatism. Yes, you can call that Chinese characteristics, but I don't think it's necessary to always add that on to everything that China does. You're going in a new direction. Accept it.
One more question?
No, could I just add something to that?
Okay.
I think there is an issue because Yang Rui referred a number of times to Scandinavian type of socialism. When you have a small country that is wealthy, you can provide all kinds of benefits and welfare. Is that socialism? I have some questions about that. Because you go to Denmark, you go to Norway, you go to Finland, you go to Sweden. They are about as entrepreneurial as any other European. They are capitalists. The Swedes, IKEA, they're capitalists. They're not socialists.
Yeah, you're buying into this notion that somehow socialism and capitalism are at odds. And that was the conventional logic post-World War II, Cold War, that they couldn't coexist. I think China and Europe has shown quite convincingly that you can have capitalism and socialism together and that they're not at odds. In fact, they can be quite helpful to each other.
Yeah, I don't think we need to have them simultaneously. I think since Deng we've had a heavy degree of capitalism, but I think now with Xi and his 19th five-year plan we're going to see relative socialism because basically Mao Deng got the country under control. They let capitalism flourish, and you need money to pay for socialism, and that's what we're going to see post-19 CPC. So I think it's capitalism, then socialism.
I have a question about the rising middle class in China, that after its recent economic development, the middle class has really flourished in China, and the general mass, they are being fed well, they're being educated, the healthcare is improving. Do you guys believe that this will lead to potential democratic uprising in China, that the people want more now because they have the food, they have the education, but now they want something else beyond that? Do you guys believe that China will in the future have a certain direction that will lead to certain, let's say, democratic ideals being wanted by the people?
I have to answer that because I think it's absolutely absurd. This is a U.S. thesis that this would happen. I think democracy, we see what is happening to democracy. You get people like Donald Trump elected. You get Brexit. You get all kinds of interesting, or lack of movement in India. When India, India, as I said, 30 years ago, GDP was $1 less than the U.S. per capita, than China per capita. Now is 1/5 of China per capita.
But every day I live without any fear of my property being taken away by the government.
Well, I also live without fear of my property being taken by the government in Beijing.
You're in Beijing.
Yeah, I am in Beijing, and it seems to be fine. I think the concept of democracy, for example, when you have a population that is not educated, or, for example, there are a lot of illiterates or undereducated, uncultured population, what does that vote mean?
There's got to be some middle
Creation
ground.
of a political class that runs on campaign contributions. Is that the best for the country? Is every 4 years an election best for strategic planning for the country? What we have in the 19th Party Congress is a plan for the next 20 years. That's what we need.
If I may just quickly weigh in here. The thing about China, which I, from an outsider's perspective, found so fascinating about was that it works much like a billion-dollar company. Mm-hmm. There are people who enter the pyramid, work inside the pyramid, and there are contradictions that happen within the company, but they're resolved. However, I would just not like to be on the side of the argument that is contrary to what the party believes. That's the only thing. So when you think about the population as a whole, sure, the company gives the perspective that everything is happy outside. But is it really happening inside? Which is debatable. I won't necessarily say it is, but it's questionable. There would always be a certain section of society that would want something different from what the masses, if you like to say, want. And in many ways, that is similar to what a democracy is. So when one looks at China, one needs to look at it from an unbiased eye that is not necessarily marred by a lot of the Western literature. And having said that, I believe that regarding the middle income, their needs are constantly evolving. Now, I don't know if you've invested in luxury parks and amusement parks, so on. They want to go out, they want to watch movies. How does the Chinese government now alter its stand? Because now it's got a new challenge in front of it, and that is a rising middle income. It does not want to be trapped in the middle income trap, and it wants to provide for this section of society.
Well, thank you so much, Ravish. Something I like particularly is the Chinese red of your scarf. That means the arrival or advent of the new year. Let's say Happy New Year to the audience of Dialogue and the CGTN. With that, we come to the conclusion of the first chapter on capitalism versus socialism. Tomorrow, the same time, we'll come back to look at the same issue. Thank you so much.